So the recent events in Minneapolis, the murder of Renee Good, and the swirl of interpretations around it, including the propaganda campaign by the Trump administration to spin it, are a jumping off place to understand how fascists use what I'm calling semiotics, or the sign making abilities of human beings to grab power and try to keep power. For instance, Noam calls Good a terrorist, and we have other administration officials gaslighting, you could say, the public about what happened there. The fundamental basis of human social life is signs, is based on how we use signs. We are a sign-making animal. And Fernand de Saussure in the late 19th century, along with Charles Sanders Peirce independently, created the discipline of semiotics that has been sort of applied, I think, not to its full capacity and full meaning for us in various disciplines in literature and communications, so forth and so on. So the basic insight in semiotics is that we use signifiers that are not the things that we intend, like the words I'm speaking, the sounds I'm making, the little squigglings on this page, the letters, to mean things. And so that's the signified. The signifier and the signified together are the sign, according to Saussure. And these signs are, I would call, as a metaphor, the molecules of our social life, even our minds, the way we think, so forth and so on. So these molecules are things that we don't look at, we don't observe, because we are intent on the things that we're trying to say, or the things we are perceiving and imagining. And it is part of the real. We see the real world through signs, but also we communicate about it through them. In any case, we don't notice the molecules so much. And I think all of the social sciences are based on signs and semiotics. That some of them have noticed that in very, very specific instances doesn't mean that we've understood entirely how that influences all of the social sciences, including the applied social sciences like law and economics, so forth and so on. So Charles Sanders Peirce observed that signs generally fall into three categories. One of them are icons, that are things that look like the thing that they represent. Photographs can be a form of icon, but also obviously painting, imagery, so forth and so on. The little shoe represents a shoe. Then there are indices, that are things that represent the signified by the context. In other words, the arrow pointing one way means that you go that way in reality, in terms of where it is positioned. And then finally, most importantly, symbols. Symbols are words and mathematical symbols, and also even the device I'm using is using signals, which are kind of a symbol, that are using to communicate with other parts of it. Cybernetic networks and computers are sign making and sign using and sign fabricating devices. So in the latter category, symbols, the most important form of sign, there is an arbitrariness of the sign. In other words, these are attached to what we mean by convention, and also different, obviously, language groups and different subcultures attach slightly different signifiers to, or signifieds to signifiers. And so that is arbitrary. The relationship is created by acts of creativity and will to some degree, and collaboration with other people, that those signs come to mean things for us, and we actually create society in part through the fabrication of these signs. I observed over 10 years ago in this piece on my blog about how the right-wing leadership tends to present itself as willful, as being defiant of reality, even to say that they will create a reality based on their sense of entitlement, the sense of representing, quote unquote, the right sort of people, and saying that they can willfully assert that reality is one way, even if reality is a different way. And this is a way to elevate themselves over reality temporarily. It's always a temporary elevation because reality will eventually catch up with them and unfortunately with us. And the fascists in the middle of the 20th century, in particular Adolf Hitler, but also Mussolini, presented themselves as particularly willful, quote unquote, strongmen to suggest that they could bend reality to their will. But fascism is impossible as a movement without propaganda. And propaganda is something that has been used for many centuries, including by churches and religious movements, and also by governments up until into the 20th century. But the use of mechanical means of reproduction of signs, like the printing press, and then radio, and then television, and so forth and so on, all of these created opportunities for actors who are power hungry, who are trying to grab power, trying to change reality based on their sometimes willful, often willful visions. It becomes super important. So propaganda was a very, very important function within Nazism, among other things. But propaganda was also used in the First World War by all sides, and in every war you see propaganda being used in different forms. So this is the use of signs, of these are icons and symbols and so forth and so on, to create a feeling and an opinion in the viewer. And advertising is also a form of propaganda, and also uses semiotics, among other things, continuously to influence buying behavior. Now, Umberto Eco was a famous semiotician, and he did write this essay called Eternal Fascism, but in a way he didn't apply his semiotic views for some reason to his observations about fascism. And these are the list of his the features of fascism, which doesn't really emphasize what I'm saying here about the use of signs and sign-making systems to exploit people's perception of reality by creating this alternate reality. And of course, George Orwell's 1984 and other of his works highlights the way in which the authoritarian and totalitarian movements of the mid-20th century used the propaganda tools, the sign-making tools of society to try to create an alternate reality and try to distort people's perception through their use. And in the 1960s and 70s, there were certain philosophers that had interesting ideas like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault that in so-called post-structuralism and deconstruction that created a sense of everything being somewhat subjective and there being no really real world out there. And while this is not entirely the fault of those philosophers, we now live in a post-truth, postmodernism, or at least that is the tendency of our society, in part through the use of social media, cyber networks, so forth and so on, these sign-making tools that we've used that have confused many people. So I would say the fascist leaders that we now have and have had for over a century have been able to do what they do in part because, as Barbara Altemeyer in this book suggests, that they have a sociopathic or a psychopathic relationship to reality and to power. They can lie without compunction, that they see that they believe that their goals are so important that they can distort reality, and they can and try to bamboozle people basically by distorting their perception of reality. And this is why they are able to use these sign-making tools so effectively, and we need to be able to observe that and understand that to fight them.